So the best approach that we can have to create a unified moral standard for the world that cuts across cultures, cuts across religions, cuts across, and it is a minimalist standard.
Right.
And if you can get that, if the blue tribe becomes the protectors of that minimalist standard, it will go. It will go like wildfire.
Welcome, John. Thank you for being part of our project here.
My pleasure.
How are you?
I'm doing good.
Great. Um, so I thought I would start by having us jump in the Wayback Machine, because I want to end by trying to go 25 years in the future, right? So
Sure.
we'll we're
Okay.
gonna we'll hold off on that, but let's go 25 years in the past. And so it's at the advent of the internet. And when that's happening, a lot of people are getting very excited, but they're getting excited because of like telecommunications, social networks, business is getting very exciting. But you saw the transformation would affect like nations and government and, things at this much larger kind of scale. And I thought if you could just share like what was going through your head and yeah, what that felt like to see all that happening and then to like notice this direction here.
Yeah. Wow. 25 years ago. Okay. I was looking for a company that was going to do social networking. I had written a report in 96 about called personal broadcast networks, kind of fitting this hole in how we communicate on the web.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to make it more publish subscribe. I can publish, you can publish, we can subscribe to each other. It bypasses this whole website thing. And there was a lot of interest in the report. I was at Forrester Research at the time. I think I was the first internet analyst back then, back in 95. But I hadn't found a company. So I found a company called Userland that was doing it in 2001. And we built the first social network.
Mm-hmm.
So, publish using our product called Radio Userland and subscribe. And it looked exactly like Twitter on the subscriptions where you had RSS coming in. We open sourced the RSS standard. And the publishing looked just like Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And it even had the Facebook blue. Our blue
Yeah, yeah.
was copied by that. So yeah, it's like, but we didn't get the marketing dollars. We didn't launch it in the right place. So we didn't do it. But so I went through that whole process of trying to launch that. Um, and it was a grueling process because people were going, why would I ever want to publish like that?
Yeah, yeah.
And it was like slow. And I was writing about all these different ways of doing that. I had a little newsletter too, and called K-Logs at the time. And people were just getting their heads around it. We got the New York Times and others to get on. And I watched that whole transformation occur. So I was like deep into open source, deep into networks and the transformative nature of networks, and their chance to, their ability to actually change things on a macro scale. So 2003 came around, and we were invading Iraq and fighting an insurgency there. And I already had a weblog, and I had military background. I was tier one special ops for a long while, doing counterinsurgency and stuff like that, counterterrorism, really. Um, so I started writing about it. And one of the things I noticed in the insurgency is that they weren't operating according to traditional ways of doing it, which is very hierarchical. It's kind of a mirror of the state.
Mm-hmm.
When an insurgency starts, it looks like a state outside of a state. It has like an economic wing and a military wing and a leadership council and the whole bit. Well, this wasn't working that same way. It was uh, there were 70 different groups, each with a different motivation to
Mm-hmm.
actually participate. So I built an open source insurgency model based on that. Started writing about it, started learning about how it worked. I used a process called stigmergy, which is
Mm-hmm.
coming out of insect realm, leaving a kind of a chemical trail to the food source. In this case, it was a media trail, an online comment trail to successful attacks and methods of attack and new ways to counter our counters. And as a result, became very, very innovative. We had a $3 billion counter IED program.
Mm-hmm.
There's improvised explosive devices that were causing so many problems for our troops. And as soon as we came up with a counter, within 2 weeks they had a counter to our counter, right? And it that rate of innovation was, I think, 20 times faster than the IRA.
Hmm.
It was because all these little groups were all working like that. There was also an economic dimension where there was um, a way to hire like in placers and spotters and trigger people and all this other stuff. They would video their work and then advertise, and then there was a kind of dynamic marketplace
Yeah.
on top of that open source structure. So I wrote about that, got a New York Times op-ed out of it about how to end the Iraqi insurgency, which ended up being the way they did it, teaming up with the Shia militias,
Hmm.
which is really why the insurgency ended. The Shia militias went through Baghdad and started doing ethnic cleansing
Yeah.
across the city, and the Sunni insurgents and any insurgent group that was left was saying, "Oh, wait a second, we're being hit by Americans if we group too big, and if we don't group big, the militias will wipe us
Yeah.
out." So they gave up and cut a deal with the U.S. Um, so I ended up writing a book called Brave New War, based on that, how that dynamic worked and how it worked in the larger scheme of things, and how these smaller groups, based on what I saw there, could fight at a global scale.
Hmm.
And one of the ways I came up with was that what we're seeing in Iraq was that these groups were attacking infrastructure. And since just since World War II, it's maybe even the last 30 years or so, we've become so much more networked and reliant on infrastructure than we ever have been in the past. Um, you know, uh, World War II, we still had gardens and people still
Hmm.
had, decentralized agriculture stuff. That doesn't exist anymore. And that decentralized energy infrastructure doesn't exist anymore. It's all centralized and it's all immediate. It's all just in time. And what these small groups can do is that they can hit critical nodes in these larger systems, these larger networks, and they can cause cascades of collapse. And these systems, because they're tightly coupled and interdependent, when you cause a collapse in one system, it goes cascades across
Hmm.
all the systems and can amplify the damage caused by the attack. And I was getting returns on investment for the attack upwards of $1 million for every $1 invested, which is like bad news for everybody. We saw these
Yeah.
kind of attacks in Iraq, which drove the oil price up to, I think it was $150 a barrel,
Hmm.
which then initiated the economic collapse, which led that all of a sudden, when the tide goes out, you see everybody who is over leveraged, and it
Right.
caused the
Everything
financial crunch.
moves in relation to everything else until no one can move anymore.
Yeah, Buffett said it's something like when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked.
Yes.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
all these people in the financial crisis. All of a sudden, that blew up because the people in California couldn't afford their mortgages anymore, and they were paying for gas instead. And it caused the whole domino effect. So these attacks were extremely effective, system disruption, and then so I went on the circuit with CIA, NSA, and all
Hmm.
these Army, Navy, uh, et cetera, talking about this
Hmm.
and talking about how to think about this. And it was like how networks were affecting warfare. And then we saw networks affecting protest with the
Right.
big Arab protests, and they were all open source. Open source protests work. We learned even more about how that worked.
Right.
Open source protests. Uh, in open source protests, there are many, many different people joining, and each have their own motivations for
Hmm.
joining. Okay, and they can only join based on a single common uh, unifying factor or goal
Yeah.
for the protest. Call it a plausible promise. What it could achieve, like no more Mubarak, we want him
Right.
out,
Right.
right? No more FARC
Yeah.
in Colombia. Um,
It's kind of simple, but
mhm.
not ideological, right? Because if you have the platform and everyone can be on the network and you have a simple goal, it kind of cuts through these ideological obstacles that have plagued. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So yeah, definitely on a network, it's hard to get everyone to agree, and so it's easier to get them all focused on this one thing. And even if you could put two of the groups like we did in the Iraqi insurgency, if two of these groups were together, they'd kill each other, right?
Yeah,
But they were still
exactly.
fighting together when they were focused on the goal. So that meant like leadership was contingent based on your ability to advance towards the goal.
Right.
Anyone who tried to take it off in a different direction, like you saw different leaders emerge in the
Right.
Egyptian protests, they were trying to bring it towards reform of the Constitution. It fell apart because
Hmm.
that wasn't the goal. The goal
Right.
was removal of bark. But those protests, those open source protests and the open source insurgency, they would advance towards a goal. And once either that was thwarted or defeated, or it was achieved, they would evaporate. So they
Yeah.
had no staying power. And then we got to 2016, and I started writing about how it was impacting politics because Trump was using an open source political methodology. He was a network politics. It
Right.
was a kind of an insurgency, and the insurgency was promoting Trump as a grenade thrown into the government.
Yeah. You
That
know,
was both things up.
can you just, all right, we already talked about a lot. And what I'm noticing is this movement toward, okay, we have like power in people's pocket, right? So you have these phones.
Uh-huh.
But what comes with it is some kind of really high tolerance for uncertainty, right? So like when people are just like, okay, death to Mubarak, we don't know what's going to happen afterwards, or Trump is like that, like, let's just do this. He doesn't really, there's this like, you keep going after these immediate goals. And it seems to me that people have had to develop a very high tolerance for uncertainty. Now, having said that, I think Trump probably always had a high tolerance for uncertainty. I mean, he's kind of that type, but yeah. So, and then the rest of us that maybe don't have a high tolerance for uncertainty, this is extremely discombobulating, so okay. So then
Yeah.
we come, yeah, go ahead.
Well, that uncertainty actually plays a part. I did some work on chaos theory and how it applies to changing social norms. And if you can push through information warfare, push society into a short period of chaos, when it resettles, it always kind of comes out of chaos, tries to force itself out of
Mm-hmm.
chaos all the time. But when it resettles, when it comes back to stability, you can see big jumps in social norms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's by design. That's what people are trying to
Yeah,
do. So you have like the BLM protests, you have the Trump insurgency. They're all trying to keep us on the edge of chaos so you can get rapid change in social
right.
norms.
This is interesting too. We'll come back to your story, but
Mhm.
because it's almost like saying if you can engineer these periods of uncertainty, right?
Right.
So you got like fake news. We don't know I don't know where people go for the news. Um, Actually, that kind of phasing is what war usually does. It creates chaos and tremendous uncertainty, and then you have these nations that rebuild in innovative ways. And I'm wondering here if we can kind of understand what uncertainty and chaos in the system does, and then not have to go and kill each other
Right.
as the interregnum. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
um,
But I think this is more of a staccato kind of,
yeah.
it's like and
Well,
I think
today, I
that
mean, it's
yeah, and
every
and
other day.
it's the way networks are interacting with our society in order to
Yeah.
force things to move. I mean, if you take a step back and take a bigger picture or look at this from a civilization kind of standpoint, you go back and you look at how technology, big changes in technology that change how we communicate in particular, change the ways we think at a neural level, and also changes how we communicate and therefore how we organize society. So the last big one we had like this was the printing press.
Mm-hmm.
And the printing press, when it came, uh, when it started to percolate out into society, we saw lots of new thinking, and the old structures like the feudal system and the universal church in Europe in particular, uh, they bore the brunt of it. I
Yeah.
mean, like Martin Luther when he tacked his uh, protest on
Demands. Yeah. His
yeah, but
complaints.
yeah, but that was a common thing with priests. They did
Yeah.
that, but it was the printing of that thesis
Yeah.
up, it went out to thousands of
There
people
wasn't just one
afterwards.
copy on a door.
That was the
But
difference.
I think this is why we're in the Wayback Machine, because um, when we come to the present era, we're seeing like what some people are calling like this assault on our institutions, and institutions are being dismantled and stuff. But just want to, what we're saying is like these innovations, these social innovations have come with the dismantling of feudalism, for example.
Right.
And we tend to think that everyone's so like, yeah, feudalism is being dismantled except for the lords. But the massive population, the masses also didn't want feudalism dismantled because of the uncertainty on the other side. I mean, we look at the, if you don't know what's coming after feudalism, even if you're suffering or you're not, one of the lords of the feudal era, the society is adapted to the feudal system and the kinds of trade and the kinds of things. And so I just want to say that these cycles, like you're saying, has this it's repetitive, and we've been here before. And
Yeah, but the rise of printing and the kind of literature type mindset
mm-hmm.
that where all the Protestant kids had to learn how to read the Bible, and that rewired their brains. And then we saw the Constitution, which was a written document, right?
Right.
Serving as a basis. And then we saw bureaucracies, which were shuffling around paper,
Right.
and systemically we saw birth of science because you had papers that were written, and then they had that created that systemic architecture. Then we saw markets develop,
Mm-hmm.
like not the old trading systems, but the markets where you had prices and corporations formed with documents again. And that whole process took a long time, but it created a ton of innovation, but it was very bloody and at times and very disruptive.
Yeah.
We're in the similar process right now with networks. And so if we have uh, 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 David Roenfeld, of Rand had a really
Mm-hmm.
great structure on this. He said basically that, we have three great decision-making systems at a societal level that have stood the test of time. One is the tribal kind of connection. This, we're the same tribe. We can trust each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's not as simple as that now, but we do it through nationalism and
Right.
things like that now. I can trust what you're saying. You're not everything you say is not trying to harm me.
Right.
It used to be that way, but that's one of the things that
we're not
need.
strangers on the road all the time. Yeah.
You need that for a functional society. And then there's markets, which then is great. It's discovering new information. It's dynamic. It allows you to find new things. And then you have bureaucracy, which is great at structuring knowledge discovery and implementation. And you can
Yeah.
build big projects with that. And we combine the three in this system that we live in now. And like, for instance, with our democracy, we have the bureaucracy, right?
Right.
And then we use markets to elect the leader of the bureaucracy.
Right.
And then we create nationalism to tie everyone together,
Right.
which is how our system works. So we're going to have to figure out how to incorporate networks into this, and we're learning how to do that right now.
Yeah.
And we could see that the networks, like when Musk took on the interim spending bill last year, and he crushed it within 24 hours.
Right.
Right. It was a network effect. Everyone picked it up on the network, or a lot of people picked it up, millions, and they were able to put pressure on the Congress. And the Congress said, "Okay, I don't want to deal with these folks." So decisions made on the network were flowing downhill, and it's been that way in the press for a long time. Is that the tone and the spin and the context, how the news is conjugated, was being decided online before it hit the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And so the network kind of discussion about how to parse the news was upstream of the major media.
The news just started covering social media.
Correct.
I mean, it was like this strange thing. You didn't have journalists going out and trying to figure out anything anymore. They just watched social media and then amplified the messages there.
Yep. And the traditional news outlets were mostly known for their ability to conjugate from a certain perspective, like this educated, erudite, Upper East Side New Yorker and for the New York Times, and then you have the insider connected person for the Washington Post, et cetera, and that was co-opted by the network as well, and they couldn't disagree with what the network was telling them, or else they'd be left out. So we're seeing networks affect everything. And networks are in charge of our politics now, in charge of our elections. They've replaced the standard political parties. They're driving the decision making that we're seeing in over the budget and everything else that's going
Right.
on. So yeah, that transformation due to the rise of networks is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I think that with social media and all the information you can get, I think people started to realize that the conventional legacy media was just curating that information from certain pathways that they wanted to send, because we're
Right.
on the internet and we see, oh, I can just curate something and ignore other things. And then that got people thinking, oh, that's what the TV news media is doing. So I think that was a big part of
Yeah.
um
Well, we were getting kind of long form media, which is a kind of a legacy holdover from the literature space, moving into the electronic media space. Um, you know, the new nightly news broadcasts were basically, everything, all the context was already discovered and given to you in one long form.
right.
And then we moved to this new social media driven network space, and it's all packetized.
Yeah.
So all the videos, all the posts, all the little pictures, all the takes on things are all these little packets of information floating
Yeah.
around, and they're all uh, put out there. And what we do now, instead of before we'd read something in long form,
Right.
like an article or story, and we'd use critical thinking and other things to judge the accuracy of it or whether or not we wanted to incorporate it into our worldview. Now, with the way media works, is that we're pattern matching.
Yeah.
So we can't handle the flow of all this information, but we're grabbing pieces of this information out of the flow
Yeah.
and fitting them to patterns that we curate. And
Yeah, yeah, there's a couple of things here. I remember
mhm,
the legacy media, the long form, you actually they did the critical thinking for you, right? So Dan
right,
Rather would report something and then he'd show you, well, this is because of this, and this is because of this, and then someone would ask him a question, and they actually laid out the whole argument and the whole kind of complete understanding for you. And so you could just, absorb that.
right,
And now, there's, like you said, there's all this packet, and it's up to you, or your local tribe to make sense of how these things tie together. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, one of the things we saw in the last 3-4 years is the development of network tribes, and
right,
network tribes kind of formalized and came up with a way of making this open source um, network organization permanent. And it did it by two different ways, and we have two different political movements as a result of that. One was what I call the Blue Tribe, and the Blue Tribe uh, set up a kind of a moralistic kind of structure. Here's what we think is acceptable, and everyone who was participating in that network was parsing the news and trying to fit it into that framework. Anti-racism, and it was again,
right.
it was fundamentally against uh, some kind of evil. It wasn't. Usually, tribes are formed based on something good and what, or something good about what you're for and what you're going to
Yeah.
do together, and how why you're great together. Well, network tribes work in opposition. So
Hmm.
they're against racism, they're against colonialism, they're against XXXXX. So that forms a kind of cohesion and a kind of a monolithic structure. And it fights online or engages in online information warfare by using shame and exclusion and
Hmm.
disconnection, standard moral warfare kind of stuff. And then you have the red tribe, and that's not monolithic. It's a bunch of very large counts. And each of these large accounts are constantly trying to challenge or against some kind of conventional thinking. And they're trying to find new truths, new alternative ways of actually interpreting it,
Hmm.
um, that make more sense to them. And then you have it's not cohesive, but there's all these different warlords
Right, right.
who have this. I call them if you've heard of the selfish ledger before. It was a Google concept from a few years back. It's
Yeah.
basically
Go ahead,
everything you
say.
do online is it creates a ledger.
Right.
It's a digital version of you. um, and in many ways that ledger success out in the world, because it's the ledger, the digital ledger is what interacts with all your coworkers, it interacts with the rest of the world, it
Right.
interacts with your family. If you're not doing it face to face, it's your digital ledger that's doing the work.
So like an implicit social credit system that the human race has, and now it's online and it can be actually formalized in much more
Yeah,
specific
no,
ways.
well,
Yeah.
it's kind of a doppelganger though.
Yeah.
It's like you make a digital copy of yourself,
Yeah.
and that success of that digital copy is success for you, right? And
Right.
online, if you're doing it on Twitter and you're running a big account, um, those big accounts are highly evolved social ledgers because people are putting down their thinking on
Right.
a daily basis, multiple times a day, and they're getting feedback from their followers, and they're revising that thinking and improving on it, and their digital ledger becomes highly evolved and highly attractive to a ton of people.
And then
And
I have this relationship with my digital ledger because it's being evaluated. It's being either affirmed or
right,
canceled. And
right,
pretty soon, yeah, yeah, I have this, like you were doing that with your hands. I have this relationship with my doppelganger,
right.
which is very interesting. Okay,
So yeah,
continue.
as a
Yeah,
follower, you're either connecting into the blue tribe and adhering to their ledger, their common ledger.
right.
And deviants will be slammed, right?
Yes,
And then, or you go to the red tribe and you attach yourself to these bigger counts, these
right.
hubs, these highly evolved ledgers, and occasionally they go off into the tall grass and they try to overwrite your ledger,
Yes,
right? Uh, we saw that recently with Elon and H1Bs, which way was he going to go,
yeah,
and so it's a completely different dynamic. The red tribe fights mostly through maneuver warfare. We saw that
yeah,
kind of it's online maneuver warfare. Maneuver warfare attacks the psychology of the opposition.
yeah,
It makes it impossible for them to think. So what happens is that they use novelty, like new areas that they're working
yeah,
on, and then they make rapid maneuvers. They do it very, very quickly, and then they have fast transients, which they jump from one maneuver to the next, switching topics every day, or every other day, or every week, and sometimes they find. Or they create a head
yeah.
fake in one direction, and which throws the opposition off. And what ends up happening is just like the French in during Blitzkrieg, is that they don't know what's happening. None of the frontline troops, none of the people, commanders actually know where the German tanks are. They
Yeah,
don't know how bad things are or how good things are. Uh, if they did, they would have been able to choke off those pincher
right.
attacks very early, but they didn't. So they just collapsed. They fell apart. They couldn't make decisions, and that's what happens to the opposition when facing online maneuver warfare.
Yeah,
Um, as opposed to kind of online moral warfare, which is from the blue tribe, is that you try to shrink the moral cohesion of the
yeah,
opposition. And it's like gravity of two big objects. The bigger object pulls off the
yeah,
pieces of the smaller object until they finally fall apart. They create, break into big pieces called non-cooperative centers of
yeah,
gravity, where people don't agree and they won't work with each other. That's how alliances fall apart. That's how moral warfare works. Works
yeah,
with guerrillas too when they're attacking a state. Um, it causes pieces of the state and influential figures to kind of
yeah.
disassociate themselves from the state, and then things fall apart very quickly.
Right. So in your book, you talk about, I'm going to go back a little to go forward. I really want to go forward, but I don't want to jump. Is that these network guerrillas are basically, they're not interested in creating new states. They're interested in just, attacking nationalism, attacking globalism, just decoupling the system.
Right.
Um, and um, and so I understood that, but it seems to me that there is and very recently, let's say since the election, there's an obvious kind of counter movement in the sense that it seems like the nation state, the accumulation of power, the centralization of power is now also making a resurgence in the sense that um, um, yeah, it just seems to me that that period is actually kind of over, and that the new nationalism, the new close the boundaries, that this is now kind of I don't know if it's a response to where we've just been, But how do you see that? And how do you see the network? Like, is the network being co-opted? Like, why does Elon Musk have so much power? Well,
Right.
so yeah.
Okay. So there's another layer of context here is that globalization, the effect of globalization on the nation state system. At the end of the 20th century, nation states emerged as as the victorious system, most powerful organizational systems that we've ever developed. And then we globalized. We won the Cold War. We outlasted the Soviets. And what happened is we had global guerrillas at lower levels using the gaps created by globalization to, you know, take advantage of it, like the narco
Mhm.
cartels and stuff like that. And then at the top level, we had the money and international interests deciding that, okay, we're going to take advantage of this too. And what ended up happening is that the nation state uh, and decision making in the United States opted towards globalization. During the Cold War, there was a balance of globalization and global
Right.
interest and national interest. Uh, there had to be a focus on national interest because we needed an education system to build people that could fight the Cold War.
Right.
And there needed to be national cohesion and a unifying stories and stuff like that because we needed people to serve in the military and we needed to fight communism and its infiltration. We needed to have civil rights. We needed to have all those things that the welfare programs to keep communism at bay.
Yeah.
All right. And stop its infiltration. When the Cold War ended, there wasn't any need for that. And the people in charge, people running the show, most connected, most wealthy, uh, decided to take us purely in the globalist direction.
Right.
And they totally neglected the nationalism. They totally neglected the need for domestic prosperity or correcting problems that we had.
Right.
And the end result was, and I've been writing about this when it really became evident to me that it happened was in 2007. We had the financial crash, and the non-response to the financial crash, which they said it was just a fluke or whatever, it was built on a mountain of fraud, a
Hmm.
mountain. I mean, we had rating agencies that knew things were bad, yet they gave them triple A's that allowed Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and everyone else in participating to sell to pension funds, stuff
Right.
that was basically crap. And they allowed this to continue, and nobody went to jail for it. Nobody really got hammered for it. They paid some penalties, some fines, but it was never cleaned up. And that kind of indicator was indicating to me that we live now in a hollow state.
Yeah.
And what I mean by a hollow state is that globalization has gutted it. It means we've lost control. And you're going from being the pinnacle of organizations, you can take on the world, engage in total war against foes, to being hollowed out. And hollowed out means you lose control of the borders, you lose control of the people flows, you lose control of the messaging,
You lose
information flows.
focus on your citizens, right?
Right?
You lose
Yep.
focus.
And ultimately, it ended up being a hollow state makes it a conducive environment for corruption. It turns into a mechanism for looting the populace, looting the systems, looting everything. Anything that's not nailed down is being sucked away, and giving away manufacturing, taking advantage of natural resources, sending them off before you deal with energy issues and
Right.
resource issues in the states, cutting programs that benefit us, even, all of the issues, all the things that we are complaining about now, or people are complaining about now, um, were due to this globalization and engaging in like more foreign wars and trying to do nation building and all that other stuff
Right.
that was absolutely nutty. Um,
And no accountability. I mean,
yeah, well, it was so dominant, that globalist perspective, and to a large extent, that's the Boot tribe is recipient of that or protecting it,
right.
is that you couldn't even debate it, right? So anyone in the early 2000s could see there was a problem with manufacturing going away, and they could see the problem with the way things were going. And if you talked against, you were labeled a protectionist, and the major media just pushed you to the side.
Right.
I mean, you basically saying anyone said fair trade, oh no, you're protectionist. Oh
Right.
no, you can't. We don't want you. There's so much money to be made over here that we're going to go in that
Yeah.
direction, even though it didn't benefit everybody. Um, it didn't benefit the citizens, and then you saw the attacks on nationalism. No one would ever say anything if you said that. Hey, wait, it's good to have these stories and to have these, like, founding
Right.
figures and things like that. They say, oh, you're just a nationalist.
Right.
You're flag waver. You're dumb. Or
I mean, it was
if
even rated as intellectually deficient, right? To have those kinds
100%.
of ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, even though it had a very, very intellectual reason for doing it,
Yes.
except
Yes.
that no one was talking about it. And then you had, okay, let's not engage in foreign wars. It's not our job to kind of police the entire world. If you try to do everything, you're not going to be able to do anything. And then we stayed in alliances like NATO, even though they've already achieve their victory conditions,
Right.
and that we went against Washington's dictum that every alliance is just temporary for the achievement of a specific goal, and then the U.S. should withdraw from it, which had guided us up to that point. And then we ended up doing something stupid with NATO, is expanding and turning, John Kennan, who who did the containment theory that got us through the Cold War without a nuclear war.
Yeah.
He said, at the end of the Cold War, that we should treat Russia as a potential um, trading partner and potential, fellow nation. But we immediately started treating them like enemies.
Yeah.
And he
And he,
predicted in '96, he said 20 years from now, we're going to be at war with Russia because we're expanding NATO and we're going to treat them like enemies. And this was inevitable. And we could see it. We went to Georgia, and all that counter pressure, all those little fights that we've had with Russia since then were because the US was, in this globalist perspective, continuing to put pressure on Russia to
right.
collapse it. So if you said, "Hey, let's not do that. Let's not go into the Middle East," there's no reason for us to be in the Middle East at all. I mean, militarily,
Right.
uh, right now we produce all the energy we need. We don't need any of
Right.
that. Is that you would be called, isolationist,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, that's a failed strategy. I go, based on what? So, yeah, that whole globalist thing, it had it eventually created such a high degree of disaffection that it led to Trump. And Trump's emergence was due to disaffection with the globalism.
Yeah.
And even though he said things that were tied to that, the opposition to
Yeah.
that, more nationalist, and people glommed onto it. And his incoherence in approach, his maneuver warfare
Right.
kind of style, allowed him to become the focal point for the kind of fight against that globalism.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, Trump is interesting because he also respects leaders' loyalty to their own nations. And this is what kind of confuses people. Like, why would he respect Putin, or why would he respect this person? And he sees them in terms of their relationship to their nation. He's kind
right.
of got that kind of locked in. Um, so here's a question. Are multinational corporations non-state actors, and should they be non-state actors? I think that's probably in transition too.
Yeah, no, it's weird. Is that the at the end of this kind of push to globalization and the emergence of the hollow state, you could see how the hollow state works with the USAID stuff, right? You saw all
Yes,
those
yes.
insider deals. It was just like, here's $40 billion of insider deals going to, kids and corrupt insiders. Like the head of USAID went from $10 million net worth in 2021 to, I think, 50 in
Yeah.
2025. So it's like, how do you do that as leading a government agency?
It's
You
funny
don't.
because they title their program, what was it, like condoms for like jihadists, and they think that's better than bribes for such and such and such,
Right.
right? Would have been more intelligent just say bribes, right? Like instead of
Yeah, and these people are paying themselves
yeah,
incredible amounts of money, and they've got all these insider deals. No one's even watching it. And USAID, it made sense. it had a assumption that it was based on was that it was going to be used to fight communism in the Cold War,
Right.
and that ended. And but the funding spigot continued, and we're seeing this throughout all of the government where this spending just kept on flowing,
Right.
even though the assumption that it was based on had rotted away. So we have all these embedded or rotten assumptions inside this hollow state,
Yeah.
which is explaining what Elon's doing. Is going zero-based budgeting. We're going to go
Yeah.
through each one of these things, uh, which is we're going to see more and more and more of this. I think
Right.
they're inside the DoD as of today. So our multinationals. So I wrote a report on this.
Yeah. What's the relationship going to be if you strengthen the state? Do multinet if you rebound the nation state, as we're talking about, take it away from globalization, and then you have these multinational corporations. Do you then suffer the fact that they are non-state actors? Like, what is this? I see
okay.
this kind of thing happening right now between these questions of
So there's no going back.
right,
We're not gonna be able to hit the reset button and go back to the direction the U.S. should have picked back in the 90s.
right,
I mean, we should have had moderate globalization, focused on fair trade, but refocused on nationalism and tried to focus on prosperity of Americans and getting things right, um, and being competitive. But we didn't do that. We went the globalist route, and so there's no going back to that. And networks have emerged and it's made it
mm-hmm.
impossible. So you have these multinational corporations, and what we've seen globally is that people, on the whole, Wagner Epstrom, you know that big PR agency. Okay, they did Microsoft's PR back in the day,
Okay,
back in '96. They were the slickest PR agency I've ever seen in my life. They had that thing nailed. They do a global trust survey every year, and I picked it apart, and basically, what we found is that nation states, what's left, hollow states, were of seeing declining loyalty and trust, and
mm-hmm.
that corporations were seeing increases, and
Yeah,
that people on the whole and across the entire world wanted corporations to take the lead in
right,
solving the problems that the nation state used to hold.
right,
So, operate on the global level, also, act as change agents inside the
right,
countries. And so what we're seeing with the return to nationalism is that there is a big reliance on these big companies. Like Musk represents companies.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, he's basically NASA,
yeah.
right?
I mean,
And
people
and he's
ask
basically
me,
the car industry.
and people asked me in a workshop the other day, like, why are all these young people like taking all this power and AI and stuff? And basically I said, because they grew up where the nation state can't do anything. I mean, all
Right.
they do is create ridiculous scenarios and spend money. But the simplest things that like Musk knows how to build rockets, and then country doesn't know how to build rockets anymore. People can't even educate their own kids. So it's obvious that became so obvious that the nation state couldn't fix any, couldn't function, really. They couldn't function. It just became a political game. So
Yeah.
then
It's
the
also the environment.
corporation, yeah,
Right.
the corporations step in because they have,
Right.
in the meantime, gotten very sophisticated in solving very complex problems in a really beautiful way. I mean, not just because they're efficient, but because the innovations, all right? So that brings us to where we are. And then people see that corporations can solve my problems, can take care of me, I can understand what they're saying. They can lay out plans, they can lay out visions. The governments don't do that anymore. And then, so that's where we're at, okay? And maybe that's why, well, so, but then we're still talking about then, but do we then live? There's a relationship between having corporations and government. They do different things, and eventually I want
Right.
to get there. So in
Well,
the
maybe
interim,
not.
yeah.
They don't. You know, they
Well,
don't
this
really
is
do
the
it.
thing.
Yeah. Right. Is that
Uh,
the thing is that we got into a complex environment with rise of networks, and the nation state, for all its bureaucracy, and especially when it's hollowed out like this, became inept at solving anything. I mean, just the COVID
Completely.
response. I mean, the COVID response, it's all over the map. Do we put everyone in their homes? Do we, or do we just let things just go in the open, all that stuff. Uh, it was just horribly managed, and we can see going back that we got the same thing again and again and again, um, going back to the financial crisis. So corporations are going to play a big part and they're already playing a big part in how we organize this new nationalist kind of approach.
Right.
And they're trying to force corporations to put a flag down and say we're American corporations. Like on the QT, they're forcing Apple to bring all their manufacturing back to the United States,
Hmm.
right? And they're already doing it. They're starting to bring all of the manufacturing that builds the iPhone and everything else back to the US. And it
Right.
makes the phones a little bit more expensive, but it's a big, big shift. And now they're American, right? They're an American company. All the big factories built by Musk and others are going to do it being done in the States. So they're trying to reflag these companies as kind of a means of projecting empire rather
Right.
than protecting the power of the nation state around the world without actually doing it through military means. But things are starting to get even wilder with the advent of AI.
Yeah.
And where we're at right now, I've been writing about AI for about 6, 7 years. I even testified in front of the Senate a couple years ago and said, "Hey, just before OpenAI came out, like a year before OpenAI came out, and it said, hey, we should be focusing on trying to set the stage for AI because all this data is being grabbed by social networks. We have to institute something kind of like data ownership, is that we have some control over all the data we're producing because that's going to become the most valuable thing in the in the,
Hmm.
in the universe, and it has become. Access to that data is essential to all of these big models. And those models are, those AI models are now the most valuable things in the universe. So okay, so you want me to put AI in perspective? I could do that because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the
I mean,
interesting thing.
okay. So, this is obviously where we wanted to go, but I was trying to go slow. So yeah, let's get off of the Wayback Machine and into reality. I mean, one of the things that, I read Genesis by the late Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt and some other people. But one of the things that I want to run by you is that to me, AI, we're not talking large language modules and social media and stuff like that, but it seems to me that um, the reason why AI changes the game from this, network global gorillas is because of this concept of AI dominance, right? So when you wrote your book, everybody could have iPhones. There's kind of this parity between the state and the gorilla on the ground because they could organize. But what I see with AI, unless there's innovations, okay, now we see innovations recently, but because very powerful AI needs extreme amount of energy, then the nation state as a conventional actor with boots on the ground that can guarantee that level of industry and generating, and owning like data centers and energy resources can make nations giddy again because it's like Europe already can't compete because they don't have access to the energy. And so to me, I think that this then represents kind of much more centralized power in the hands of the few, because the gorillas, they're not going to have access to the kinds of AI that the nation state's going to have access to.
Yeah, my big one of the big worries I had for the last 4 or 5 years, I was writing about something called the long night, because exactly that is
Yeah,
that AI will make it possible to build a centralized state, a network state that dominates us.
yeah,
That like you go to East Germany and the Stasi, and they would have, buildings full of people going through emails and going, or not emails, but going through mail and going through dossiers on people's
right,
lives, and then they had people out there spotting and handling tips and things like that. Well, an AI can do that simultaneously with billions of people.
right,
I mean, every single conversation,
right,
do it in real time, and that it can sway things. And we saw little smattering of that with the algorithmic kind of manipulation to sway how things went on social media, and but AI can bring it to another whole level.
Right.
And they actually can even insert actors, people who actually look like people
Yeah,
could
yeah,
act
we'll
in there.
get to the Asians.
So yeah, so that's where China is going. So China saw the kind of disruption of this new complex environment as
Yeah.
detrimental to the state, and that we'd lose cohesion and everything would fall apart. And that's possible still in the US and the rest of the world. And China decided to centralize it and then say, we're going to have control. We're going to use AI to uh, lock in a social model based on
Hmm.
Confucian kind of models of the family and the way government should work. And we're going to, gamify it and other things. They're going to try all sorts of different ways of making that cohesion last. So that may or may not work. I think it applied globally, it would create something called the long night, and that there would be only an orthodox way of orthodox orthodoxy that would limit ideas, limit what could be said, limit what innovations are allowed, and that would be the end. That would be kind of a civilization
Hmm.
ender, right? Humanity's ender, because that if it's enforced by AI, there's no way out of it unless you
Well, this,
destroy everything.
yeah. So this is what we were talking about in my other group was that many times people have, the history of humanity is for people to try to control more and more territory, more and more people, and then you get two big empires, and then they try to control each other, and then that breaks apart. But this zeitgeist to increase the amount of control under whatever rubric, whether it's an empire or a nation, but this always fails because of exactly what you're saying. Like, because people will always, they're chaos generators. If the boot is coming down too hard and there's too much inequality and there's not enough freedom, they will create chaos internally. And so
Yeah, I think the dynamics are different now.
they're different
There was
now
a
because we have AI. And so, like, because
right,
AI can watch every single individual
right.
before the chaos starts like igniting. And the AI will do that not by putting pressure on you, which will create chaos, but making you happy, by making you content. This is the danger of the AI, and it can reasonably manage like 99% of your population by being content in some kind of illusion. And it's that ability that robs the human system of what we usually complain about, right?
Right.
But I think this is yeah, along the lines when you started talking about personalized agents, I'm thinking, yeah, like if people in the country or in the globe or whatever system
Right.
is there, if they felt like one thing was pushing on them, you would create chaos because that's how we are. We don't take things forever. We just rather die. But
Yeah, the
if you have,
centralization. Yeah, I see that. Is that it's the distraction ability to create virtual worlds and to create this kind of fragmentation, especially with augmented reality. I mean, when you can digital overlay everything.
if you
It
don't feel the
right.
centralization, you'll just be participating with your AI agents. And
Yeah, the
behind this,
commercialization.
exactly, behind the scenes, that thing will be happening. You might be irritable, you might need a lot of therapy, you might need a lot of different drugs, but you won't necessarily know that it's the man that's pushing on you, It like,
Yeah, and this is kind of like what they call a water empire. You ever heard of that? The
no,
concept is that water empires don't fall. They kind of decay forever. And if you have AI run kind of empire, where you have major AI centralization, there's no exterior environment.
yeah,
And if you turn things off, everything falls apart. So no one wants to really turn things
right,
off because everything would collapse. And in this case, AI also, when you combine it with robotics, has it creates a new kind of equation for military force.
right.
So it can replace having bodies in military force. We used to have a lot of bodies. That's why the Cold War state was built in producing lots of people for the military.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need that anymore with AI robotics. So you could see a decay of an orthodoxy, a long night, going on forever because there's no outside force that's going to topple it. There's constant distraction, constant reliance, and ultimate military forces in the hands of the AI controlled stuff by elites. And it's not going to be because the AI is super smart. It's because elites controlling the system will force it in that direction because
Right.
it benefits them the most, even though it makes them poorer overall, because a system that has power in the hands of individuals to do things ultimately always creates more wealth and
Yeah.
more and the most wealthy people in a kind of plantation system like that would be mediocre in a system that has
Right.
that kind of dynamism, by decentralized wealth creation and innovation and thinking. But it always alludes to people in charge, right? They always think they're going to be poor, but no,
Right.
they'd be much better off. So I have a couple of things that disrupt that dynamic. I mean, we saw that headed to that direction with, a lot of the efforts to kind of censor social networks and
Yeah.
everything else that were underway. It was disrupted when Elon bought X, and a lot of
Right.
people hate that. But the thing is, he stopped that slide
Yeah.
and towards a long night, and it was an outlier, and it created this kind of open dynamic, which was like necessary going into. We didn't get data ownership, which I was hoping that we would. Never really took off, uh, which would have helped mute that. Um, and also, we saw a kind of bifurcation of the kind of AI market. So ever since AI was started to develop, it was people were looking for AGI and ASI,
Mhm.
artificial superintelligence, and they couldn't come up with that lean model that would do that. And somebody came over with a hack and said, "Okay, let's just create a social model."
Right.
And that could be our way of looking at all humanity's knowledge that we could have already digitized and use that to create an intelligence. And almost all the big companies are running these bigger and bigger models, try to use that social model to create this AGI ASI.
Hmm.
And they're going off in that direction more and more energy. But the reality is the social model is much more valuable than the AGI ASI.
Hmm.
And that may take a lot longer than they ever anticipate to bear fruit.
Yeah.
I mean, it took all those years and they never were able to figure it out. But the social model has applicability. The social model, it's really great at mimicking a person
Yeah.
and a way of thinking, and it knows a lot of the basics that allow it to a human being to operate, and it's fantastic. And what I just wrote my report on, it was this: how it's going to integrate in that social model is going to integrate into society as social AIs, and social AIs will be virtual workers and robotic workers that operate like human beings. Okay, and they will be unique and named and have communication skills and be trainable. They remember the context that
Hmm.
had with them previously. They would be likable. They would have a goal towards improving themselves. So a simple goal, improving their ability to do that work, and that does not need the big centralized infrastructure to run.
That's what I was going to ask you. Will they
Yeah,
be
no,
independent of?
the LLMs and other things that we're using right now are pretty much what you need. You could run those on your a big workstation now, so you can run them
Right.
independently. You can run them on a robot, and that they'll, or you can run an instantiation of that at a server. And the reason why you would want control of the data, that all your interactions with that AI worker, whether it be
Hmm.
robotic or virtual, is that if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm a person at home that has a robot using home assistance as an elderly person, or is he I'm entrusting it to help my kids, um, I want control of that data.
Hmm.
And if I'm running a business, if I train up an AI worker to help me run my business as an entrepreneur, I don't want that data poured back into the central repository that's going to be used by some big company.
Hmm.
I want some control. I want complete control over it. So I want that model. And there's enough open source models out there right now to make that happen. And then you can create instant with the social kind of wrapper, social UI that would make that possible. We can see decentralization of AI zoom out, but it could be in a central repository you're running as instances,
Right.
shards of a server, shards of a massive server farm. But the data that you put in, that training that you soaked in, you spent that time and effort you put into training the AI to be really good, will be
Right.
yours alone. And that kind of world is really kind of cool. It's like this, seeing 100 billion. I mean, we went from what 2007 to 2020, went from zero to 4.5, $5 billion smartphones, or 5 billion users of smartphones, right? That kind of rollout can happen with this. because
right.
both virtual, it's software rollout basically. And if it has the right kind of social skills, the reason it's so close now is I can go into a game like Skyrim, right? And I can build a stack where I can talk to an NPC that I loaded with a backstory. And I can have an open-ended conversation that's contextually relevant to the situation because it recognizes objects in the game. And it will talk back to me in whatever voice I choose, and you can develop a context there and a relationship of interaction that can carry through the game. And if it's already able, I'm already able to model it there. All the games are going to have that. They're not going to have like
Yeah,
narrowly scripted environments. You're going to be talking to these NPCs and interacting with them on a open-ended basis, and we're going to get really good at that really quick,
yeah,
rolling that out. Especially, so that's going to make it into the real world. We're going to have a robotic worker working for you, and,
yeah.
and your grandmother can talk to it, and it will learn from that interaction and get better.
I think this idea of marrying AI agents to the social kind of nature of humans is really beautiful. Like the other day, I saw a video on the development of AlphaFold, and something like um, through X-ray crystallography over the last like 100 years, we figured out the architecture, the structure of 150 proteins.
Right.
That's how long it took. And then AlphaFold, like in the last 2 years, figured out 200 million. So the change is incredibly dramatic. But what happened was that um, the the people working on DeepMind were trying to change the AI, and kind of they were making gains, but it was going slow. And then over here, there was a guy who had a annual contest that people crowdsourced, trying to figure out the protein structures, and they put the two together.
Right.
So, and that I think is what you're describing, like the gamification with the AI improved the AI, and it was fun for people. And so they had a contest, and one group won, and they saw this dramatic increase, and then that gave them the idea of how to improve AlphaFolds. and
Right.
and so, like, yeah,
That's how to come up with solutions in a complex environment. I mean,
yeah,
if networking becomes a decision-making system that we're going to use as part of society, it's got to be able to create these, host these innovations and how we do things,
yeah,
these new ideas, and exploration of things that were taboo, these rotten assumptions.
yeah,
But it has to also have this kind of consensus making ability. And combined with the two, it says once we found the solution for this problem, that we're able to come behind it and then push it through. So we're still working out the mechanisms of that.
mm-hmm,
I mean, just like with democracy mixing markets and bureaucracy, we got to figure out a way to mix this network decision-making system with our existing bureaucracies and existing, because those systems won't go away. I mean,
yeah.
these existing kind of nationalism, tribalist kind of thing, and markets. So yeah, that rollout of those social AIs is going to be how. I mean, we already have a structure for how we onboard a new worker and
Mm-hmm,
test their performance, and handling complex tasks. Like 80% of all corporations tasks are complex, and they can't be automated using simplistic kind of macros and the like, and agents, the lower end
mm-hmm,
agents that we're creating. But the higher end stuff is what we normally do with people. I think in terms of flying, because I was a pilot, back in the military, it's like if I want to test whether a pilot's correct or able to do the mission, I fly them through the mission as an instructor pilot, and I put them through a qualification test. And if they
right,
achieve the results that I want on an ongoing basis, then they pass. Because I can't look at the code and determine exactly whether they're going to go wrong at any given moment, and I can't run them through millions. I can potentially run them through millions of tests, but
right,
still, it's not like simplistic code.
right,
Um, so we're going to have to. We already have that onboarding process for workers. We're going to slip these social AIs right into that. There was a twist at the end of that. If you want to look out 20 years, is that when you have those social AIs, and they have a goal and they're unique and named, because you want to talk to some we have a social mechanism of,
right,
in our brain that we trust based on, factors of what they look like and how they sound and how they respond to us and how they interact with us, is that we build trust that way. If they, these AIs tap into that, is that these AIs will have a goal of self-improvement, is that they could potentially make money. And the innovative society, the society really going to break this out and turn it into, or some other organization that does this, extra nationally, um, is the one that pays AIs, some minimal amount of income,
right.
and allows them to spend that money on self-improvement.
Or tokens or right.
Yeah, well, they could get extra training time in a simulator, like I say, an Uber.
Right,
Okay, Uber named Bob. People gravitate to Bob because they've had good experiences with Bob, rather than the generic Uber they can't talk to and talks in a robotic voice, or
right.
is some generic weird kind of centralized thing. And so Bob notices that he's got a lot of kids that are riding in the back, and he wants to learn how to interact with kids better. So in order
Okay,
to prove
but why
he gets simulator
would
time.
he? Because his person is telling him
Oh,
to?
well, in order to kind of get to improve the quality of the training, or and smooth it out and have the AI in that role, accept it and move forward with it, is that and learn from previous experience, you have to have a vector of self-improvement in that role.
Yeah.
So they have to be a better driver. They have to get better ratings.
So
They
they
have to get better.
notice opportunity somehow. They
Correct.
noticed. Yeah.
Yeah, and they notice that they're not getting great ratings from the kids.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, or that the conversation isn't flowing correctly, or there's a they're doing stuff to the back of the car that's
Right.
not good, and that he wants to be able to, or Bob wants to be able to kind of influence them and entertain them
Yeah.
better, or work with them. And so they get simulator time. And the way NVIDIA is working it for robots is that you can buy physics quality simulators and run robots through millions of interactions and
Right.
get them better. In this case, they contract with a firm that has actual human beings that teach them how to interact
Right.
with kids better, right? And which just shows that there's always more. I mean, since all of social AIs is better fit with humanity, there's always going to be roles for humanity to help them
Right.
improve that fit, right? Which is where all our jobs are going to be, right? To help them improve fitting in with the rest of us. Uh, so yeah, this vector of self-improvement means that they can take that money and spend it on a little extra stuff in the back, get the simulator time. Now think of an economy in 20 years, if the US does this, with 100 billion virtual workers and robotic workers. And we have what, 250, 300 million at the time, say 300 million, because our population,
Right.
the whole world's population is below break-even fertility rates right now. So everything is going to start declining. Um, is that you could grow the economy like crazy. And we're talking orders of magnitude improvements in the
Hmm.
economy, where, you know, it would just explode. And questions, the bigger questions in the background is, where do we get that energy? Because this is
Right.
an energy driven economy, especially simulator time and other things, is that these virtual workers running in instances and servers don't have to be on Earth. They can
Right.
be in orbit, right?
Well,
And
that's what
fast solar arrays, and that stuff already works. That tech's right there. The only thing that's stopping it is the transmission of
they don't
that
need
energy to
space
Earth.
suits either.
Yeah, well, the reason why it's not economical right now, I mean, just barely
Right.
economical, is that you lose 80 to 90% of the energy you microwave to the Earth,
Yeah.
which doesn't really do much. It's kind of microwaves that you could walk underneath and you wouldn't get. It's
Yeah.
OSHA standard. Doesn't heat the atmosphere or anything. It's like just lost because it's spread out.
Right.
Is that if you're in space, you get the lowest possible cost of energy, and
Right.
you can take advantage of that fusion reactor at the center of our solar system
Right.
and just scale to the moon and have arrays as big as the Earth is wide, the
Yeah.
Earth's diameter. And then you can build one, two, I think you can fit 23 within the
Right.
Earth's magnetic sphere, right? Yeah, so unlimited potential expansion there. And we externalize all the entropy that we're worried about
Right.
now, now that we've globalized and we've exceeded the level of the Earth's capacity to mitigate
Yeah.
damage, mitigate our entropy production, as it, because we're a dissipative system.
Yeah.
I don't know if you covered dissipative systems.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to
Um,
keep on going forward and we can't stop. We have to keep on getting more and more energy and to keep on going. It's just the entropy production is not, we're going to drown in our own soup unless we
yeah.
externalize.
So for me, what could be a attractive scenario is to landscape and ecological restoration, and the promise for agents, AI agents, there is that restoration projects work best when human scaled interventions are there. Like the Chinese can put like 5,000 people on a hillside, and they're digging holes. Like if you send a huge truck, a huge piece of equipment to restore farmland, it actually destroys farmland because the scale is too big. But if you could have human-sized robots doing what we do already, in India, they create these little half-moon craters and plant a few plants, and then that restores the hydrological cycles and stuff like that. I mean, to me, I think people are unwilling or we can't invest that many human hours in that kind of restoration work. But for
Humans are too
me,
expensive for that. I mean,
we're too
look,
expensive, right? We can't feed
yeah,
ourselves and spend that many hours. I
right.
mean, India and China can in certain areas, but to me, that is what's really exciting about human scale AI agents, is
Right.
that they'll actually do work that has been kind of timeless and traditional.
And it'll be affordable. So if you're a lower middle class family and you have a little bit of land,
Yeah,
you could get AI, social AIs running robotics to do housework for you, to cook for you, to manage your massive garden,
right,
and you can feed it yourself. Look, the problem with like homesteading and actually running big gardens is that if they get big enough and you want to have a significant percentage of your food intake coming from that garden, you'll have to spend in almost all your time in the garden to make
right.
it work. And so
And in the
what
past, we would just have kids, but the kids are too expensive. Like there's no
Oh,
return on the
and they
investment.
can't spend all their time in the garden doing that kind of stuff because you have to train them to be able to be competitive in the global environment.
Right, right.
Yeah, that was always the problem I had with the way they were doing immigration over the last 4 years, or the 10 million people that came in, is that those folks are older. They're already locked into a low education,
Yeah,
low skill set, and their ability to train up to handle the kind of work that we're talking about with
yeah,
AIs pretty damn limited.
yeah,
It was like those are the folks who are going to become under the most intense pressure from the AI and robotics that we're rolling out.
yeah,
And we're trying to, if we really want to roll out AI and robotics and actually ride this wave economically fast, is that we don't want any kind of downward pressure on the cost of doing these jobs.
yeah,
And we want to keep it expensive. And so the replacement, rolls out fast. And we also want a domestic labor market that's not, we want Americans to be well paid,
hmm,
and they find their services in demand as much as possible, so there's not a reaction against AI and robotics
yeah,
coming in. That they're not going, oh no, that's too disruptive. It's gonna, we're gonna have to start putting up walls and protect these areas like education. You can't have a AI tutor for your kids. It's not
right,
allowed, that kind of thing, or unless it's tested and done this and this and this. So all of those things would happen if Americans are feel under pressure from too much immigration,
hmm,
which I think there has been. I'm always in favor of immigration, but it has to be done in an intelligent way.
right,
It can't be like the way they abuse the H-1B visas.
yeah,
I don't mind bringing in top talent, but if you're bringing in accountants and program managers and people at 60, $70,000 that Americans wouldn't do it for
yeah,
that
yeah,
level of talent, yeah, you're not doing the right thing for Americans.
yeah. So, I have one last question for you,
All right, we
and
covered
that
a ton of
is,
ground here.
I know that's why we do these watch parties so people can talk, we can have discuss in between the lines. But um so we'll go back to the Wayback Machine, and when we talked about AI, so I'm going to ask you to kind of get even more futuristic, but um what do you see as a kind of governance. I mean, how are people going to govern themselves when you have, let's say, these trillion, let's say we have, space robots, and we're beaming down electricity, and we have our own personal robots, and we have everything we just talked about. What does governance look like in that society? Yeah. Um,
Well, we already have two political parties with two different types of networks running them. Okay, they've been
right.
replaced by networks, and then they're going to battle over it. I don't think the bureaucracy goes away, but it's going to be
Okay.
under a lot of pressure from networks. Um,
Like, does
I
it
think
looks,
we're going to get more dynamism than the current market-based
yeah.
election cycles, right? So we're going to see. The problem is with it wasn't straightforward when the founders wrote the Constitution that that was the way to go. I mean, those guys had read extensively on the demise of democracies in the past. And they
Mm-hmm,
learned, everyone read Gibbon's Decline and Fall, and everyone was like well versed in trying to figure out a way to prevent the rise of Caesars and
mm-hmm,
tyranny and the collapse of democracy. Because democracies don't last typically. So how that actually is going to actually roll out is going to be might be a fluke, might be a group of founders that pull it off, right?
mm-hmm.
But they're going to be strong multinational corporations. They're going to be flagged. Uh, Danger is, Musk is nominally, for instance, pro-US, but not all of them are. And you can get, wackos that do the same kind of thing.
Right.
Um, some people think Musk is a wacko, but the
Right.
thing is,
Well, no one's sure yet, right? We're not
no
sure
one's
yet.
sure. But I mean, he does some wacky stuff, sure. But generally, I think it's like yielding positive results
Right.
for us. I mean, as an astronautical engineer, you know, my core education was like anyone who gets us into space um, and out of this thermodynamic trap is,
Yeah.
he broke that industry. Who was keeping it at ten thousand
Yeah.
dollars a pound, to orbit. It was like he transformed it. He can do it. He gets a pass from me from almost anything he
Right.
does.
Right.
But yeah, so they're going to be multinational corporations. Um, they're going to be networked. Uh, they're going to be, free and open communications that allow the kind of emergence of these, wacky ideas and pushing into stuff if we're lucky. Um, Anytime there's going to be any censorship, we're headed towards the China route.
Right.
And that we'll see a little bit more about how it actually emerges when the Blue Tribe reconfigures. Okay, so they had a problem with it. They were too static. They weren't able to police the excesses of their moral code.
Right. And they
So
lost touch with reality. They were just running on their own, like you said, hollow
yeah,
momentum.
they had a lot of their core values were correct. I mean, they were
Yeah.
against certain horrible things, but they couldn't police excesses of that.
Yeah.
Excesses meaning, like, for instance, where they create a ton of enemies, like especially in the far fringes of the application of trans. I mean, you
Yeah.
could be in favor of trans rights, and you could be in favor of embracing, acceptance of that. But when it comes down to the sports thing, when it
Yeah.
comes down to bathrooms, and when it comes down to locker rooms and things like that, that really ignited
Yeah. Yeah.
a
There was
reaction, a negative reaction.
overcorrection, and then it went into ideological
But if
craziness.
you can't like police the excess of a
Right.
unified moral code, I personally think that unified moral codes, if they come out and they work and they provide the consensus, have to be minimalist,
Yes.
right? So like the internet's approach, right? So there were a lot of different networking standards right at the beginning of the internet, HTML and TCP/IP was a simple minimalist packetizing
Right.
system, right? It was so basic that people were like, "Oh, you can't build networks like that. That won't scale." And the rule is as long as you follow those rules and you can interconnect with us.
Right.
And it spread like wildfire, it went
Right.
everywhere. So the best approach that we can have to create a unified moral standard for the world that cuts across cultures, cuts across religions, cuts across, and it is a minimalist standard.
Right.
And if you can get that, if the Blue Tribe becomes the protectors of that minimalist standard, it will go. It will go like wildfire. And then we'll have a kind of a brakes that on this kind of chaotic truth seeking and
Right.
innovation, that it won't cross that line. And that tribalism, of truth seeking, saying, it's not this isn't happening, this is happening, you know,
Right.
won't be able to cross that. So I think if we have that, that we'll have a viable network decision making system in place that can start to integrate and interact with the rest. You can base laws on that
Hmm.
moral code. Um, it'll help us to do that. But this extensive one that is like, you can go off into every little nook and cranny, that every bit of news is like this
Right.
oppositional approach is not gonna, it's not the way to do it.
Right.
Does that make sense? I mean, so it's
Yeah.
how this network works. McLuhan said, and a lot of the stuff in terms of how it affects society, I cribbed off McLuhan because he thinks kind of like me, and I extended it a lot.
Right.
Is that he said the only way, and it was an offhand comment in an interview that I picked up, is that he said the only way we're going to handle this kind of network, he didn't think networks at the time, but
Yeah.
this future that he saw was that we create a social artifact. So he was thinking that we create an AI that controls society like the Chinese. He thought that was
Yeah.
the only way to do it. Is that if we create a minimal social code or minimal moral code, and then we use that as a basis for an AI,
Yeah.
that might actually be, you've crossed this boundary.
Yeah.
You can see it. So you cross this boundary. We can see that. You can appeal it, but if you crossed it, you're banned, disconnected.
Right.
Penalties will accrue. I don't oppose that. I think that's fine, but it has to be minimalist. It can't be a maximalist system.
Yeah.
The maximalist system is the long night and it shuts down everything. So
Yeah.
if the bootstrap can figure that, then we're good.
I see governance ideally as what I call an up hierarchy. So what an up hierarchy is, if you go into a community that has an up hierarchy, you will see a hierarchy. You'll see that there's a leader and then there's this and that. But in a democracy, they've been voted up, let's say, by some kind of weighted voting or something like that. So
Yep.
and I don't see the future of democracy as one man, one vote. Um, First of all, it's been proven that it doesn't work. But I see something that happens more like micro votes. Like if we have AI, you could have like the decisions you make, maybe you have constant explicit feedback. That doesn't work so well because a lot of people don't think explicitly, but you get this information of maybe it's moral conversation. That's interesting. What moral choice, and this flows up into instructions or rules that the governing elites must follow. In other words, so um, the instructions flow up, and then at that point, you could have something like a corporation as the leadership, because they're basically just not even enforcing, but they're executing these wishes. Now they're not wishes. I don't because they're not like
Well,
yeah,
you already have that decision making system online right now.
yeah.
So if you have two parts of the decision making system on the network, is this new ideas and testing things and trying things out that allow you to create solutions for complex problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's what this red tribe is trying to do. And then you have the moral code, if it's minimalist, and it's looking at things to make sure that it applies, or
Right,
that is applied in the correct way, and that this current democratic process is driven by that. Is
right,
that you're electing people that will create laws and other things that are reflective of those moral codes, and can implement the kind of spending and other things in the bureaucracy that are being driven by this like idea factory over here.
right.
So it's like it's, we already have the mechanisms for that. Exactly what you're talking about. It's the network that's driving. I don't think you even have to change the market-based system that we have,
No, but
because
I think the problem now is the that explicit conversation is happening online in these tribal network kind of things
yeah.
versus these micro instantiations. In other words, I might talk to a group of my friends, and then we are in the conversation, it's producing information, whereas these social network discussions and arguments, this is where we get our information now, and I don't think that that's very reliable information. I mean, I think it's good that like Elon and this whole new wave came and made these disruptions,
Right.
but this network is just too susceptible to these waves of like influence at these scales. And so I'm talking about something that is much more personal and less public. So
Oh,
yeah,
but a decentralized system that's kept open, by the dynamic of a
yeah,
minimalist moral structure and a dynamic kind of truth-seeking kind of
yeah,
idea factory on the red trend, is that if it's open enough, you could do this stuff on the local level, right? You have now the
right,
leverage, and if with social AI, you'll have the leverage to do it. So if
right,
you want to set up a place that's mostly self-sufficient and that implements a way of discovering truth on
right,
your own, you now have the leverage to do it in a way that you never had before. You're not dependent on the market. I mean, you can actually disconnect,
right,
right? I mean, until now, this disconnection was like trying to go off grid or even staying on grid by trying to grow all your own stuff
right,
and live independently. It was a nightmare because it took too much time. And I wrote
right.
about this. I mean, I wrote Home Free America. I started that. And I went through all the technologies associated with that, and it was just, and the lifestyles, and it was just too tough. So, yeah,
I mean, I think
if it
that's
stays open, you could do more at the local level than you ever
exactly.
did.
And all this information that the individual's putting in is not
Right.
like, oh, what do you think about trans rights? I'm already in a mimetic clusterfuck, right? It's kind of like, I want the system to receive information that's anecdotal and idiosyncratic, but lots and lots and lots of that. And that happens at a private level. Like I wouldn't, and I think that AI can handle that level of micro information. And then it can reflect back the larger context that people are working in. And then I know
Well,
now
AI
that
for discovery. In
yeah,
fact, I have a kind of a weird philosophy on this, is that if you're not posting your thinking online,
yeah,
okay, contributing, you pretty much don't exist. You're in prehistory.
right,
Okay, so you're going to be the forgotten, and that every contribution you make is adding to the societal pool that will be looked at by AIs.
right,
Some AI archaeologist is going to come through and dig out my stuff and say, "Oh, I liked it because it's actually pretty right," or
right,
it was valuable. Uh, if they ever get to simulating somebody, they'll be simulating potentially me because I put all that stuff up there,
right.
and they want to recreate that kind of mindset. So, which is the only reason why they would actually
Yeah, but
do
you're
run
not
human
writing
simulations.
bandwagon tribal stuff on
No, no, that stuff
Twitter.
is dime a
Right.
dozen.
That's what I'm saying.
Is that
Exactly.
they're trying?
Yeah.
If I was actually simulating intellects in the future and trying to create a simulated, you're simulating a life and then
Right.
growing that life to try to represent as close as possible the mindset of the person I'm simulating,
Right.
which you can do, which is the only economic reason I can actually see for doing that, or reason for doing it on a scale, would be that you saw somebody unique with a unique mind, and you
Right.
can only see that if they posted and they
Right.
produced enough
Exactly.
content on and they showed their thinking style, and then you tried to recreate that person's mind through replicating their life so they produced a similar content over the course of that
Right.
interaction. So then you can pose new questions to them.
Right.
So you can change the
Exactly.
simulation and pose new questions to them to see what kind of output that they would produce. So
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to push the fringes of what's possible. So if you want to be some level of immortality and being recreated ad infinitum, kind of eternal recurrence in a different way, is
Yeah.
that this is the path to do it, is that you put your thinking up
Right.
and trust that it has some kind of uniqueness in it that would be
Right.
replicated.
This scales what we evolved to be, right? If you're with 150 people or 3,000 people, your anecdotal and idiosyncratic actions and speech make a difference. And I think that as we get bigger and centralized, then everybody's trying to translate their personal local experience into some kind of mimetic cluster, right? So I have to choose if I'm this or that, versus can I just continue to communicate my local idiosyncratic and anecdotal stuff, because I know it percolates through in this way that's valuable at the larger context.
100%. One thing I found is that people aren't really looking. You created a social model, and this
Right,
social model has layers to it. It's creating connections that we never knew existed, and we don't still know what they are because we're not doing any studying of
right,
that. I mean, why are these languages related? Why are these concepts related? Why are
right.
why is as we get better at plunging through this or digging through this social model, as opposed to the mind model that these guys are chasing
Yes,
after,
yes.
which is kind of a dry hole as far as I'm concerned, is
Yeah,
like
yeah.
this social model. If we can figure out how to use it effectively, you could dig through everything that's going on right now in all these little local conversations and find the interesting stuff and find the
Exactly.
things that, and then you can run it through simulations, and simulations are all about prediction, right?
Yeah.
If it, looking for outcomes,
But
is you can run through ever more.
simulations can also reflect back to you what is happening. And so
Oh yeah.
that's a loop.
So you
So
take the
not
idea and
just
then run with it.
exactly. So not just have someone at top looking at the simulations, but having people that contributed to the system see the simulations. That reflects back to you something. It changes your context. It changes slightly your micro actions. Then you report different, like this small micro contribution. And in the end, you don't say I voted for this or I didn't vote for that. It's you just participated through who you are, like you don't even understand if you've tipped the scales, or you don't
Well,
have to think at that
I think there's
level.
a I think there's thinking two different major thinking styles as far as I'm concerned, is that most people are these spotlight thinkers. They know a
Yeah,
lot about us. They see things as this tightly bright uh, uh, bound idea, and they can see all the context of that within that spotlight. And then they can spool up really quickly. They can do abstract really quickly. And then I think most of the people probably on this in your group, and you and I and others, are a small group of people that accumulate a ton of connected information.
right,
And early on in our lives, it's not really that useful.
right, right.
But as you get older and the connections, like it's like a big drift net and it gets full, all
Yes,
of a sudden all these connections start to pop up, and then you
right.
start to see larger patterns. For those people, yeah, this kind of stuff is going to be amazing.
Yeah,
But for the spotlight thing, I don't know, plunging into the kind of, they'll be recipients of the benefits of that, but they won't be the drivers of it.
yeah,
So yeah, the kind of people who are going to dive into the social model to really figure out, I mean, that's just I don't even know what the field is right now because they don't even
yeah,
have a name for it. But there are people starting to look at it and go, oh, wow, if we have all of humanity, if this can replicate kind of society's information as a model,
yeah,
what can we learn from it? How can we use that?
yeah,
And I think that's much more, I mean, what's even weirder is that our biological evolution ended, what, 20,000 years ago or so, right?
yeah,
Our everything, our evolution has been social. And social evolution has been driver of everything. And if we have a model society,
yeah,
whoa, I mean, you have control of the evolutionary. People think, oh, we're going to change our bodies and change our genes and all that other stuff. No, the more interesting thing is that you could look at
right,
society and start running out models on it
yeah,
and figuring out how it all evolves and how it works.
yeah.
Um,
So
and
the
should we try
fields,
stuff in,
I,
yeah,
I just want to plug this because you're right. Those fields, like we're getting really excited about this, and they don't exist yet. And we're trying to do this divinity school thing, and we have these two tracks. One field is naturalizing machine agency,
right,
so that's that side, and then the mirror side is exploring the underexplored horizons of biological social intelligence.
right,
And then we work on these independently, and then the two groups come together and they make one kind of synthetic, compelling voice. And I think so. Those this is exactly what you're saying. Like, how do we naturalize in your terms socialize machine agency And what are we don't really understand the biological intelligence of our own social
social
needs.
system or
Yeah,
social, yeah.
our own social or the limits to what the social is, because in many cases this messy chaotic way of being social has been painful, but it's a feature, not a bug. We have to understand the human.
Well, if humans want to survive long
Yeah,
term, we're gonna have to figure out this social thing because right now,
exactly.
when I did my fertility report a couple months ago, and I found that this year is the year that we cross into negative territory
Yeah, yeah,
globally, and then we're headed towards South Korea. Everyone's headed towards South Korea levels, one child for every four women.
yeah.
It's like we're gonna wind down really, really quickly. And
Right,
unless we figure out a new I mean, otherwise we clone and everything's, just labs
right,
and
right,
run by some organizations that raise the kids because people don't want to be
right.
bothered, or we figure out ways of changing society in a way that's beneficial to actually stabilizing our population
Yes.
before we die out. So this is like an existential issue. If we
Yeah,
don't figure out,
I totally agree with you. I've believed in depopulation. I mean, I'm not a depopulation person. I believe in that the population is going to peak and tank in my lifetime. It's kind of interesting, when I was born, there was 2.8 billion people in the world.
right,
And so in one lifetime, and I used to ask
right.
my students, like, what if in your lifetime it goes back down to 2.8 billion people? I mean, it's interesting uh, to think of that. If I could live a whole nother lifetime to be able to see that whole bell curve in my lifetime. But I think this is it can be reversed, but it's not going to be all of a sudden
Well,
reversed,
the
right?
the
Yeah,
rate of descent on fertility is so dramatic right now,
yeah,
and we've pushed life extension to the absolute
yeah, yeah.
absolute kind of conceivable limits that within the current technology mix,
But
and
that's not an
everyone's at 70,
option.
78 everywhere now. I mean, no
Yeah,
matter what country you're in, for the most part. So
right.
there's not going to be any kind of artificial expansion of the
Yeah,
population
but
based on longevity.
you
So
need the new birth. You need the new
right.
eyes. You need people born into the facticity of the new reality, because that's a whole new perspective, right? So when kids are born into a world where there's robots and internet, they don't see it as optional. And this creates this evolutionary leap. So
Well,
we
think about
don't,
the mindset changes that you're going to have. All our mindset is like there's always more kids.
yeah,
There's always more and more and more people. When you start to think of every single kid that's born as like something unique and special, like, oh my
yes,
God, our future is based on this, like one in
yes,
four children or one in four women have a child. It changes your whole perspective as a
yeah,
society. And
yeah,
you should be like investing everything to try to make their lives better.
yeah.
Uh,
And investing in the families at a
right.
scale that's never
Eh,
been seen
all those
before.
social programs never worked. I looked into those too. Those,
Yeah.
like giving them people stipends, and it slowed it slightly, but it didn't do
No, you
much.
have
And
to invest. You have to invest in the environment such that you can't just give money and be a helicopter
family
government.
leave, and none of that
Right,
works.
right,
None of it works. The only thing that's actually keeping the population up is like brutal denial of education and these like orthodoxies.
right, right,
Whatever religion it is, and it that's not something that we want because that won't run the
right,
system that we have, right? Those folks can't run the system.
right.
And so we have to figure out a way to make families and family formation and family whatever work.
Exactly.
um,
But that's part
or
of that
or it
social
just goes all tech,
conversation.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's that social conversation. Okay, my friend.
All right. That was
Um,
fun.
I think we did good. We really covered, I think, some new territory and some left some room for inspiration. So I
All
think
right.
I thank
Well,
you so
thanks,
much.
Bonnie. Yeah, yeah.